They called our planet a death world. I did not know that until Ambassador Velshan told me, standing face to face with me aboard her crystalline ship in orbit above New Nairobi. She had 6 eyes. 4 of them were full of tears. The other 2 were locked on me like I was either the galaxy's last hope or its next mistake. Maybe I was both. Sergeant Adeyeze Okafor, she said, her translator turning her soft clicks and musical tones into something close to English. Your world is listed in the Covenant Xenological Registry as a Class 9 hostile biosphere. That is the highest classification before a planet is marked completely uninhabitable. I looked at her calmly. And yet here I am. Yes, she whispered, here you are. That was 3 months before everything changed. A lot happened between then and now. Let me tell you all of it. The Vorkai came from the galactic core. Nobody knows exactly when they started spreading. The oldest Covenant records suggest they have been consuming worlds for at least 40,000 years. They are not evil in any way you could sit down and argue with. They do not feel anger toward the species they devour. They do not plan cruelty. A wildfire does not hate the forest it burns through. The Vorkai are simply hungry, always hungry, and over tens of thousands of years they became extraordinarily good at feeding. They move in swarms. These are not ships made of metal and wires. They are living things, biological in every way, grown from the bodies of billions of individual drones bonded together under a single hive will. Each swarm carries a weapon called the pulse. It is an electromagnetic signal that disrupts the nerve tissue of most known thinking species in the galaxy. Walk into a pulse field and your higher brain functions simply stop. You stand still. You cannot think. You cannot run. You cannot fight. You just stand there while they take apart your world piece by piece. 143 species make up the Galactic Covenant. Every single one of them had tried to stop the Vorkai at some point. Orbital strikes did not work because the Vorkai absorbed the energy from explosions and converted into fuel for their bodies. Poison gases did not work because within 2 generations the drones adapted and became immune. Nuclear weapons made them stronger. The Sirith, tall and elegant and older than most human civilizations, lost 11 fleets trying to stop a single swarm. The Pelosi Collective lost 4 of their homeworlds. The Marundi, possibly the most philosophically advanced species in the known galaxy, were reduced from 12 billion souls to around 40,000 survivors living on a cold, distant moon. So they came to us. The debate in the United Nations General Assembly lasted 6 days. I watched pieces of it on a small screen bolted to the wall above my bunk, between sets of training exercises. There was a great deal of shouting. There were speeches about readiness, and about the dangers of making enemies, and about humanity proceeding with caution and careful diplomacy. Good speeches. Reasonable speeches. The Joint Chiefs of the Human Defense Forces did not wait for the vote to finish. They were already loading us onto transport ships before the final count came in. My unit was called the 3rd Expeditionary, 12th Human Defense Legion. Everyone who knew us called us the Helldivers, though nobody could agree on who had started the name. We were assembled deliberately, each member chosen not just for combat skill but for something harder to measure, something the selection officers called environmental resilience, though the soldiers themselves had a much shorter word for it. Corporal Dmitry Volkov had grown up above the Arctic Circle in a settlement with no heat support systems. The government had run out of funding and the colonists had refused to leave. He had learned to survive winters that dropped to -60 degrees and to build shelter from materials the land provided. He had encountered his first large predator at age 11, alone in the woods behind his home. He had come home from that encounter with a minor injury to his left arm, and a story nobody believed until he showed them the proof. He did not talk about it often. Private First Class Yuki Tanaka came from the flooded megacity of New Osaka, where 6 million people lived stacked in vertical communities that rose above the rising ocean. Resources were limited. Space was limited. The social pressures in those towers created environments that required constant alertness just to survive daily life. Yuki had developed the ability to read a room instantly, to identify threats before they became obvious, and to move through tight spaces with a speed and silence that still surprised people who had served beside her for months. She could also hold her breath for 4 full minutes, which had saved her life twice and someone else's life once. Staff Sergeant Kwame Osei, who went by Bull among the unit because nobody had called him Kwame since basic training, was the largest human being I had ever personally stood next to. He had spent 8 years before enlisting as a deep-sea mining operator on the Antarctic shelf, working in pressure suits at depths that would collapse an ordinary submarine. He had survived 2 separate hull failures and 1 methane vent event that had thrown his rig nearly 30 meters through the water. He described all 3 incidents using the same word, annoying. And then there was me. I had grown up in Lagos, deployed across the Sahel Desert region during 3 separate resource conflicts in the 2090s, and spent one very memorable year working alongside a bush tracking unit in the Congo Basin, where the mission had been finding poachers moving through terrain that was genuinely, actively dangerous, not in a dramatic sense. In the practical sense that things lived there that had developed, over millions of years, very efficient ways of ending the lives of things that were not careful. You learned to be careful. You learned quickly. Ambassador Velshan had looked at our service files and become very still for a long time. "These are not your most decorated soldiers?" she asked eventually. "These are exactly our best," I told her. She made a sound that her translator rendered as a question that also expressed grief, which I thought was remarkable engineering on someone's part. The Covenant's staging fleet waited at the edge of the Herland system, 40,000 ships. I pressed my face against the viewport of our transport as we slid into formation, and I simply stared. 40,000 ships of every imaginable shape, from vessels that looked like enormous seeds to structures that resembled ancient cathedrals stretched across the stars, to others that were all thin angles, like skeletal fingers reaching into the dark. The most advanced and numerous alliance of intelligent species the galaxy had produced, all gathered in one location. The mood coming off that fleet felt like the moment before a burial. When our transport docked with the Covenant command carrier, a ship so large it had its own internal weather systems, we walked down the ramp into a reception hall and found approximately 30 alien representatives waiting for us. Different species, different sizes, all of them completely still, watching us come down that ramp with expressions I was only just beginning to learn to read. The silence held for several seconds. Bull sniffed once. "They look afraid. Of us or of the enemy?" Yuki asked quietly. Dmitri considered this. "I believe the answer is both." He was right. I had learned enough about Sirith body language by then to recognize that their wing cases were pressed completely flat against their backs, which was the equivalent of a human taking a step away from something unexpected. The Pelosi delegates were pressed together as a group in a way that spoke clearly of a shared instinct to flee, held back only by collective dignity. Admiral High Council Zoran stepped forward from the group. She was Meherundi, one of 40,000. She stood 2 meters tall, her fur the color of old silver, her eyes deep and wide in a way that made you feel she was looking at something much farther away than just your face. She studied me for a moment. I looked back. "You are the Deathworlders," she said. It was not a question. It was almost a prayer. "We are humans," I said. "But yes, that works." The briefing room was designed to accommodate 12 different species at once, which meant the air filtration was working hard, and the seating arrangements served none of us perfectly. We sat on the floor. It did not matter. The tactical display showed us a Vorkai swarm in the process of consuming a green and blue world, the kind of planet that from orbit looks peaceful and full of life. The kind of planet that in this display was being covered, slowly and completely, by a living tide of organisms each the size of a large building. They moved with terrible patience. They dismantled a coastal city the way a flood dismantles a sandcastle. Not with anger, just with the steady, unstoppable logic of something that is larger and does not stop. I heard Yuki breathe out slowly beside me. "Range of the pulse field?" Bull asked. Zoran turned her planet-wide eyes toward him. "At full swarm density, it extends approximately 40 kilometers from the nearest drone cluster. Any thinking being within that range experiences complete neural collapse within 90 seconds. "Does it affect humans?" he asked. The room went quiet in a way that was different from before. This was a thoughtful quiet, a hopeful quiet. "We do not know," Zoran said. "You were never included in our models. In 40,000 years of contact with the Vorkai, no species from a Class 9 world has ever entered the Covenant. We have no data." I thought about that carefully. 40,000 years of the Vorkai, spreading across the galaxy. 143 species catalogued, studied, and ultimately unable to resist the pulse. Every one of those species had evolved on worlds that were, by Earth standards, gentle. Predictable, worlds where the greatest threats were manageable, where predators were rare or absent, where the planet itself was not constantly trying to end the lives of the things living on it. Earth had never been that kind of world. Earth had spent millions of years producing organisms that competed fiercely, adapted constantly, and developed pain tolerance out of sheer necessity. The species that eventually became us had been prey before we became hunters. We had been shaped by ice ages and disease and drought, and every category of natural disaster the planet could produce. We had been afraid every single day of our long history on that world. We had also learned, across those millions of years and hundreds of thousands of years of human civilization, to keep moving while afraid. Fear had never had the luxury of stopping us. There was always something else to be afraid of right behind it. When do we deploy? I asked. The first drop was onto Vethkara 4, a Sirath colony world with a population of 6 million, currently 40 hours into an active swarm landing. Our transport broke through the cloud cover at high altitude. Through the thick viewport I could see the swarm below. It covered the ground the way weather covers a landscape. It stretched to the horizon and beyond. The sky had turned a brownish color from the biological material drifting through the air. Somewhere underneath all of that, a colony beacon was still transmitting. Someone was still alive down there. We dropped. At 32 kilometers from the nearest drone cluster, my suit reported the pulse field. I waited for something to happen. I waited for my thoughts to slow and stop. I waited for the neural shutdown that had ended the resistance of every other species in recorded history. My heart was moving fast. My palms were damp inside my gloves. My mouth was dry. I was genuinely, completely, deeply afraid, in the most honest and physical way a human body can produce that experience. I was also still thinking, still watching the ground come up, still calculating where we needed to land and in what order, and who needed to cover which direction when we touched down. Confirm status, I said over the squad channel. Is everyone still operational? Yes, said Bull, in the tone of someone who has decided to be mildly offended by the question. Unfortunately, said Dmitri, which from him meant he was fully functional and already thinking 3 steps ahead. This is very bad, said Yuki. From her, that phrase meant she had already identified 6 possible approaches and was narrowing them down. The pulse hit us at full force around 18 kilometers out. I want to be honest about what it felt like, because I have read the clinical descriptions and they do not capture it properly. It felt like someone had replaced the inside of my skull with wet sand. The pressure was real and immediate. My vision blurred at the edges. For about 4 seconds I lost the ability to form a complete sentence, even inside my own head. And then my body, built on a world that had been testing the limits of biological endurance for longer than the Covenant had existed, did what human bodies do when pushed to their limits. It adapted. It pushed through. Not completely. The pulse still hurt. It still slowed us. But it did not stop us. We hit the ground and we kept moving. The first drone cluster we engaged was enormous. 50 meters of layered biological armor, multiple limb clusters capable of tearing through building materials, and acid glands that could project corrosive material at range. It was, by any reasonable standard, an apex predator. It had consumed cities. It had walked through the weapons fire of species far more technologically advanced than humanity without noticing. Bull placed a shaped charge against the third limb cluster joint with the calm precision of a man who has done complicated technical work in terrible conditions for years, because he had. The drone cluster turned. It was confused. The hive will behind it, the distributed intelligence that connected billions of drones, had no framework for what was happening. Something was inside the pulse field. Something was still moving. Something was attacking. We kept attacking. Yuki located the acid gland apertures and began redirecting the organism's own defensive systems against itself using tools she had improvised from parts of her kit during the drop, which I genuinely had not seen her assemble and will never fully understand. Dmitri was doing something with a length of cable and a detonator that I chose not to look at directly, based on the expression on his face, which was the expression of a man who is very happy with a very specific idea. The drone cluster went down in 11 minutes. Somewhere across billions of drones, spread across a continent, the hive will paused. I had never considered that a hive mind, something with no central location and no single point of consciousness, could experience something like surprise. It turned out that was not entirely accurate. 9 days. The battle for Vethkara 4 lasted 9 days. The Covenant's own projections had given the planet 40 hours before complete consumption. Instead, 12 humans in cracked and repaired armor moved through biospore storms thick enough to reduce visibility to a few meters, fought through terrain that was being actively dismantled around them, and refused to stop. We adapted our tactics constantly. When the drones changed their formation, we changed our approach. When new drone variants appeared that had clearly been adapted specifically in response to what we were doing to them, we spent 20 minutes figuring out the new weak points and then kept going. The Vorkai are fast adapters by the standards of biology. Humans are fast adapters by the standards of everything. We lost people. I will not name them all here because some things belong to the people who were there and not to written records. Good people. People who had survived everything their home environments had produced and who did not survive Vethkara 4. I carry them. That is all I will say. On the 9th day, for the first time in any Covenant historical record, a Vorkai swarm reversed course. It withdrew. I remember staring at the tactical display when the confirmation came through. The withdrawal was not fast. It was not panicked exactly. It was slow and deliberate, the way something very large and very old moves when it encounters a situation it needs to think about. The swarm pulled back from the colony, from the beacon that was still transmitting below us, from the 6 million people who were still alive because 9 humans had refused to stop moving. Zora-An was waiting when our transport brought us back to the command carrier. She looked at the 9 of us for a long time without speaking. "The hive will is recalculating," she said finally. "Our monitoring systems have detected a pattern we have never recorded before. Something in the distributed consciousness of the swarm that our analysts have labeled, after some debate, as uncertainty." Bull looked at her steadily. "Good. In 40,000 years of contact with the Vorkai," she continued, "this has never happened. They do not retreat from prey. They do not adjust their strategy based on resistance. They consume or they are destroyed. You have introduced a third possibility." She paused. "They are uncertain. For the first time, they do not know what comes next." I was extremely tired. My armor had 4 separate cracks sealed with emergency compound. I had a deep bruise along my left side that had turned impressive colors. I smelled like burned biological material, and a long week without proper rest. "Then we keep making them uncertain," I said. The 6 months that followed were the hardest period of human military history. I say that knowing what history contains, knowing the wars humanity had fought against itself across the centuries, and I say it anyway. 6 months of campaign after campaign, moving from world to world, each engagement teaching us more about the Vorkai, and teaching the Vorkai more about us. More humans arrived. Word had traveled back to Earth and to every human settlement in the system about what the pulse did not do to us. The Joint Chiefs sent everyone they could get onto a transport. Arctic survival units from the far northern settlements, whose members had spent lifetimes operating in conditions that other species would classify as immediately lethal. Urban combat specialists from the great flooded megacities, who had spent careers navigating environments that required constant creative problem-solving just to stay alive. Deep environment workers from the outer planet operations. People who had spent years working in pressure and cold and radiation with minimal support, who had developed a relationship with danger that most beings in the galaxy would find difficult to understand. All of them Deathworlders. Every single one. The Covenant watched us the way careful people watch a controlled fire. They knew it was doing what needed to be done. They also never entirely forgot that fire does not have a natural stopping point. I will not pretend we were easy to watch. The way humanity fights is different from the way any other species in the Covenant fights, and that difference made some of our allies uncomfortable. We are not philosophical about conflict the way the Mherundi are. We do not have the elegant tactical frameworks of the Sirith. We are relentless in a way that does not look graceful, and we find solutions that look unreasonable right up until they work. And we keep going past points where every other species in the room has concluded that stopping is the logical response. It turns out that specific combination of qualities was exactly what the situation required. The Vorkai changed in response to us. They developed new drone variants specifically designed to counter human tactics. They began adjusting their pulse frequency to try to find a range that affected our neural tissue more severely. They started using their drones in formations that had never been recorded before. After 40,000 years of using one strategy because it worked perfectly, they began to think in new ways. We changed faster. The final major engagement took place above Mherundi Prime. The Vorkai had targeted it with clear intention. The oldest species in the Covenant, the cultural and philosophical heart of the Alliance, home to 3 billion beings who had already watched their civilization contract from 12 worlds to 1, who had survived the loss of everything except each other and the wisdom they carried. The swarm that came for it was unlike anything previously recorded. 17 hive wills, working in coordination for the first time in the history of Vorkai encounters. The Covenant's analysts had named it the Grand Consumption. Their projections were not optimistic. Their most careful models, run repeatedly with every variable adjusted, produced the same result every time. The planet would fall. I sat in the briefing room and listened to those projections, and looked at the people around me, and thought about Zora-An's word. Uncertainty. We had spent 6 months teaching the most successful predator in galactic history to feel uncertain about its own abilities. We had done that by being something it could not model, could not predict, could not stop with tools that had always worked before. If the 17 hive wills were working together for the first time, it was because we had made them afraid enough to try something new. And if they were trying something new, there was a possibility, maybe a small one, that it had a weakness they had not yet discovered. They needed a common signal to unify 17 separate hive wills, I said into the quiet of the room. That signal has to come from somewhere. It has to broadcast from a point, and a point can be found. The plan we developed was not, by any traditional military definition, a good plan. It required a small force to punch through the outer defensive layer of the largest swarm ever assembled, navigate through the combined active drone fields of 17 hive wills, locate the unification signal's origin point, and destroy it. Every Covenant officer we showed it to found a professional way to express the opinion that we were describing something that could not be done. None of them said we should not try. The breach took 4 hours. The combined pulse from 17 unified hive wills at close range was a different experience from anything we had encountered before. It was not pressure behind the eyes. It was pressure in every part of your thinking. A constant effort just to hold a single clear thought long enough to act on it. Half our pilots were operating on instinct and trained reflex, their conscious minds working harder than they ever had just to stay connected to what was happening. We found the signal origin. It was a biological structure of a scale I had not expected, built from the interlocked bodies of approximately 2 billion drones in a formation that the xenobiologists later spent considerable time trying to describe accurately. The most complex living architecture ever recorded, they eventually said. A monument to what biology could produce when given 40,000 years and sufficient hunger. It was extraordinary. We used everything we had brought with us against it. The unification signal stopped. 17 hive wills, suddenly without their connection to each other, without the shared consciousness that had been directing them as a single enormous entity, became 17 separate and deeply confused subswarms moving in 17 different directions without coordination. The Covenant fleet, which had been working very hard just to slow the advance, suddenly found itself facing an enemy that had forgotten what it was doing. What followed has been named the Battle of the Fracture in the Covenant's historical records. It is studied now in military institutions across 14 species. It was the first time in recorded history that a Vorkai formation was not merely pushed back but completely defeated, not by endurance or attrition but by understanding something about how the enemy worked and finding the single point where everything connected. I was not conscious for most of it. My suit systems had moved past the warning phase into the active intervention phase, which involves a number of uncomfortable medical processes that I have no desire to describe. I woke up in a medical bay on the command carrier, with Yuki sitting beside me eating something warm, and Zora-an standing in the doorway. "It worked," I said. My voice came out rougher than I expected. "It worked," Yuki confirmed, without looking up from her food. I looked at Zora-an. Her silver fur was very still. Her planet-colored eyes were watching me, with something I had not seen from her before. "Your people," I said. "Are alive," she said. 3,040,000, all alive. She stood in the doorway for another moment, and then she said something I had not expected. "I owe you an apology, Sergeant Okafor." I waited. "When your species was brought to our attention," she said, "the dominant opinion in the Covenant Council was that humans were too unpredictable, too aggressive, too dangerous to interact with. We had been aware of your world for 200 years. We chose not to make contact because we were afraid of what you might become if given access to the wider galaxy." She paused. "We were afraid of the wrong thing. We were afraid of what you might do to us. We never considered what you might do for us." I thought about that for a moment. I thought about Earth, about everything it had tried to do to every generation of humans who had ever lived on it, and about what all of those generations had produced in response. Not peace exactly, not safety, but something. A quality that was hard to name and very hard to stop. "We would have liked the warning earlier," I said honestly. The sound she made was the Mburundi equivalent of a quiet, genuine laugh, the first one I had ever heard from her. "The Vorkai are not gone. I need to be clear about that. There are still swarms active in the outer reaches. There are still worlds being threatened. There are still human units deployed on long operations in difficult conditions, doing hard work that does not end just because one battle changed the shape of the conflict. But something shifted after the fracture. The Vorkai pulled back from their most aggressive expansion. Their swarms moved more slowly, more cautiously, spending time in systems without immediately advancing. The hive wills were recalculating, reorganizing, trying to build a model for an enemy that had appeared in their history without warning after 40,000 years, and refused to fit any category they had developed. The Covenant shifted too. I saw it in small things at first. The Sirath stopped their fear response when humans walked past them in the corridors. The Pelosi delegates began asking questions in briefings, curious questions, the kind people ask when they are trying to understand something rather than simply survive it. Zora-an began using my given name. And then one morning a young Marundi researcher knocked on my door, barely past adult age by their measurement, carrying a datapad and looking somewhat nervous. She had been assigned, she explained, to update humanity's entry in the xenological registry. The planetary classification stays the same, she said. Class 9 hostile biosphere. That seems right, I said. But the species classification is being changed. She looked at her datapad, then up at me, and her eyes held something clear and steady. You are being recategorized from uncontacted primitive, isolation recommended, to strategic ally, handle with care. I thought about Veth Kara 4. I thought about the 9 who had come back and the ones who had not. I thought about Merundi Prime still turning in the light of its sun, with 3 billion people alive on it. I thought about a young Adaeze Okafor learning, before she could read, that the world did not take care of you, that you had to pay attention, that you kept going regardless of whether it felt possible, because the alternative was much worse, and also boring. Handle with care, I said. Yes, the researcher said. We thought that was fair. I looked out the viewport at the stars, at the dark between them where something old and enormous and hungry was thinking about us for the first time, uncertain, recalculating, encountering something it had never once needed to plan for in 40,000 years of moving through a galaxy that had never once told it no. The galaxy had cried for help. We had answered. We were still here. And in the space between the stars, something that had never learned to be afraid was learning. Good. Sergeant First Class Adaeze Okafor 3rd Expeditionary, 12th Human Defense Legion filed at Merundi Prime Station, 2803 CE.